The year was 1398, and the screams echoing from Timur's war camp outside Delhi could be heard for miles. But these weren't screams of battle. The fighting had ended days ago. These were the sounds of something far worse. On the morning of December 17th, 100,000 prisoners of war stood shackled in the winter frost, their breath forming desperate clouds in the cold air. They had no idea that within the next 72 hours, most of them would be begging their captors for a swift death that would never come. The man responsible for their fate sat calmly in his silk tent, examining architectural drawings for his next great monument, a structure he planned to build from an unconventional material. Human skulls. Timur the Lame, known to history as Tamerlane, wasn't just another medieval conqueror. Between 1370 and his death in 1405, this Turco-Mongol warrior carved out an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to India, from Russia to the Persian Gulf. But unlike other empire builders, who are remembered for their administrative genius or cultural achievements, Timur left behind a legacy written in blood and terror. Modern historians estimate his campaigns killed approximately 17 million people, roughly 5% of the world's population at the time. To put that in perspective, that would be equivalent to killing 400 million people today. But the raw numbers tell only part of the story. What truly set Timur apart, what made mothers across Asia and the Middle East invoke his name to frighten children for centuries afterward, was the creative sadism he employed against those who defied him. This wasn't the random brutality of an undisciplined army or the collateral damage of medieval warfare. This was calculated, systematic, and designed for maximum psychological impact. The guards began moving through the prisoner camps that December morning with an efficiency that suggested careful planning. They divided the captives into groups of 100, binding them together with heavy ropes. The prisoners, soldiers who had fought bravely defending Delhi, farmers who had been conscripted into the Sultan's army, young men who had never held a sword before this doomed campaign, exchanged confused glances. Execution was expected. This strange organization was not. What happened next would become one of history's most horrifying examples of Timur's first signature punishment: mass live burial. But unlike the quick suffocation of being thrown into a pit and rapidly covered with earth, Timur's engineers had designed something far more elaborate and terrible. Teams of workers had spent the previous week constructing thousands of individual pits, each exactly 6 feet deep and 3 feet wide. The dimensions were precise and purposeful, deep enough that a standing man would be buried up to his neck, narrow enough that he couldn't move his arms. By noon, the work had begun. Prisoners were forced down into the pits one by one, their arms pinned to their sides. Earth was packed around them, compressed and tamped down with wooden tools, compressed so tightly that escape was impossible, and breathing became labored. But they weren't suffocating. Not yet. That would have been too quick. As the sun reached its peak on that winter day, 100,000 heads dotted the plain outside Delhi like some nightmare crop. Then came the horses. Timur's cavalry, the finest mounted warriors in the world, formed ranks. The trapped men, realizing what was about to happen, began to scream. Their voices created a sound that witnesses later described as unlike anything in human experience, a collective wail of terror that seemed to make the very air vibrate. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, drums sounded and the cavalry charged. The horsemen rode back and forth across the human field for 6 hours. The horses' hooves crushed skulls, snapped necks, and left faces mangled beyond recognition. Some men died instantly. Others took hours, their screams gradually weakening as blood filled their mouths and lungs. The cavalry didn't stop until darkness made it impossible to see. By then, the screaming had stopped. In its place was a wet, gurgling sound from those still clinging to life, and the nervous whinnying of horses walking on ground turned muddy with blood. This wasn't Timur's first use of this punishment, nor would it be his last. 3 years earlier, in 1395, he had employed the same technique on a smaller scale after capturing the city of Sarai, capital of the Golden Horde. But the incident outside Delhi represented the largest single implementation of this horror. Timur himself watched the entire process from a raised platform, occasionally taking notes. His secretaries later reported that he seemed most interested in timing, how long it took different groups to die, which formations of cavalry were most efficient, whether the screaming affected his soldiers' morale negatively or positively. The answer to that last question revealed another layer of Timur's genius for terror. Far from being disturbed, his troops became more loyal. They understood that their commander's willingness to inflict such punishments meant he would stop at nothing to avenge any harm that came to them. Cities began surrendering at the mere news of his approach, having heard what happened to those who resisted. But live burial was just the beginning of Timur's repertoire of horrors. His second signature punishment emerged from a very different situation, revealing the calculating mind behind the brutality. In the summer of 1387, Timur faced a rebellion in Persia, led by a coalition of nobles who had once sworn loyalty to him. When he finally crushed their resistance in August of that year, he could have simply executed the ringleaders. Instead, he demonstrated a punishment that combined physical agony with psychological torment in ways that medieval people found particularly unbearable. The captured rebel leaders, 17 men in total, were brought before Timur on August 23rd at dawn. They were stripped naked and forced to stand in the courtyard of a captured palace. Then masons were brought forward, along with cartloads of bricks and buckets of mortar. The rebels watched in growing horror as the workers began constructing walls around them, not to imprison them in a room, but to entomb them while standing. The technique was diabolical in its precision. The walls rose slowly, starting at ankle height. Mortar was laid, bricks were placed, and the structure grew inch by inch. The process took all day. As the walls reached their knees, then their waists, then their chests, the condemned men could feel their fate approaching with agonizing slowness. They could still see the sky, still breathe the air, still speak, and they used that ability to beg, to plead, to offer everything they owned for a quick death. Timur sat nearby, eating his meals and conducting normal business, as though nothing unusual was happening. When the walls reached neck height, around 6 o'clock that evening, he gave an order that made the punishment even more cruel. The masons were to leave small gaps in the brickwork at face level, just large enough to allow air to circulate, just large enough that the victims wouldn't suffocate quickly. The walls were completed by nightfall. leaving 17 heads protruding from what looked like a garden of brick pillars. Then Timur implemented the truly sadistic element. Guards were posted to ensure the heads were regularly given water, not enough to sustain life indefinitely, but enough to prevent death from dehydration for several days. The men were left there, immobilized, exposed to the August sun by day and the cold of desert nights, unable to move anything except their facial muscles, slowly dying of starvation and exposure, while being forced to remain alive through careful water rationing. Historical accounts differ on how long the last man survived, but most sources agree it was at least 4 days. Timur left the structures standing as he moved his army onward. Travelers passing through the area for months afterward reported seeing the brick towers with their gruesome contents, the heads reduced to skulls, still protruding from the masonry. This punishment terrified people in ways that simple execution never could, because it violated deeply held beliefs about death and burial. In Islamic culture, in Christian culture, in virtually every faith represented in Timur's empire, proper burial of the dead was considered essential for the soul's journey to the afterlife. To die slowly, while already partially entombed, unable to receive proper funeral rites, represented a spiritual catastrophe as much as a physical one. Yet even this didn't represent the peak of Timur's creativity in inflicting suffering. That distinction belongs to his third signature punishment, one so elaborate that it required specialized equipment and trained personnel to implement. It became known as the boats, though this name hardly captures the reality of the horror. The punishment was first recorded in detail during Timur's campaign in Georgia in 1392. After capturing the fortress of Vadzia in September of that year, Timur found himself with several dozen prisoners whom he considered particularly worthy of severe punishment. They had killed some of his officers during the siege using burning oil. What followed was a punishment that borrowed elements from ancient Persian torture techniques, but was refined by Timur into something uniquely terrible. The victims were stripped and forced to lie on their backs on specially constructed wooden tables that were slightly concave, creating a shallow depression. Their arms and legs were spread and tied securely. Then a second wooden frame, matching the first, was placed on top of them and tied down. The frames were designed so that only the victim's head, hands and feet protruded from the ends and sides. They looked, from a distance, like bizarre wooden cocoons. On the morning of September 14th, 1392, the real horror began. Slaves approached the immobilized prisoners carrying buckets of a mixture Timur's torturers had perfected. Equal parts honey and milk, stirred until smooth. They force-fed this mixture to the prisoners, pouring it down their throats until they were gagging and choking. Then they painted the mixture all over the victims' faces, their hands, their feet. Every exposed bit of skin received a thick coating. The wooden frames were then carried to a marshy area near the fortress where the water was stagnant and the air thick with insects. The frames were propped up at a slight angle and left in the shallow water. At first, the prisoners probably felt relief. The cool water would have been welcome after the force feeding. But that relief lasted perhaps an hour. By midday, the first flies appeared, attracted by the sweet coating on the exposed skin. They landed on the prisoners' faces, crawled into their nostrils, their ears, their eyes. The victims could shake their heads violently, could scream, could try to blow air from their noses, but they couldn't dislodge the insects. More flies came, drawn by the scent of the honey milk mixture, then wasps, then mosquitoes in clouds so thick they looked like smoke. But the real torture began on the second day, when the prisoners' bodies, force-fed and unable to relieve themselves, began to evacuate waste into the wooden frames. The combination of excrement, the sweet mixture, and stagnant water created an environment that attracted specific kinds of insects, carrion flies, and parasitic wasps that began to lay eggs in the filth accumulating inside the frames. The prisoners could feel the larvae moving, could feel the insects burrowing into their skin, could do nothing but endure as they were slowly eaten alive by thousands of tiny mouths. Timur's guards maintained the torture with business-like efficiency. Twice a day, morning and evening, slaves approached with more buckets of honey milk mixture. They force-fed the prisoners, ensuring they remained alive and conscious. They reapplied the coating to exposed skin. The victims were kept hydrated, fed, and conscious, while insects devoured them from the outside and waste poisoned them from within. Historical records indicate that the strongest victims survived for over a week. Guards kept detailed logs of who died when, noting the exact day and hour. These records were preserved in Timur's archives, apparently studied by the conqueror himself as he refined his techniques. One account describes a victim who lasted 9 days, his face so swollen from insect bites that his eyes had vanished completely into the puffy flesh, still conscious and begging for death that wouldn't come. When the last victim finally died on September 23rd, the wooden frames were left in place as a warning. They remained there for months, the skeletons still locked inside, the wood gradually rotting away. Travelers reported seeing them the following spring, now just bones and rusted iron bindings, a testament to Timur's message: resist me, and you will die in ways that make you envy the dead. This particular punishment was expensive and labor-intensive, requiring special equipment and dedicated personnel. Timur used it sparingly, reserving it for cases where he wanted to make an exceptional example. But word of the boats spread across his empire faster than his armies could march. The detailed descriptions passed from soldier to merchant to peasant, created a myth around Timur that transcended his actual military power. He became, in the minds of millions, a demon in human form. Yet Timur's genius for terror extended beyond elaborate torture devices. His fourth signature punishment was notable for its terrible simplicity and the way it turned natural human bonds into instruments of torment. It emerged during his conquest of Syria in 1400 and revealed a psychological sophistication that disturbed even the hardened warriors of the medieval world. After capturing Damascus on March 19th, 1401, Timur found himself with thousands of prisoners, including many families whose men had fought in the city's defense. Executions would have been expected. Mass enslavement would have been typical. Instead, Timur announced something different. He would spare the lives of all prisoners on one condition: fathers must kill their own sons. The announcement was made at noon on March 21st in the main square of Damascus. The assembled prisoners initially thought they had misheard. Then soldiers began separating families, pulling boys older than 10 away from their mothers and forcing them to kneel in rows. Fathers were given swords and a simple choice: kill your son quickly and live, or refuse and watch while we torture him to death before killing you as well. The square filled with sounds that witnesses struggled to describe in writing: mothers screaming, children crying, fathers pleading for any other option. Take me instead, take both of us, enslave us, anything but this. Timur sat on a raised platform, impassive, and repeated his command: begin. What followed was perhaps the most psychologically devastating of all Timur's punishments, because it forced people to destroy what they loved most to preserve their own lives. Some fathers refused outright. Guards immediately grabbed their sons and began the promised torture. Not quickly, but slowly, using knives to inflict wounds that caused maximum pain without killing. They kept this up until the father gave in and agreed to perform the execution himself, or until both father and son were dead. Most fathers broke within minutes of watching their children suffering. Those who complied discovered a final twist to the torment. They weren't executed after killing their sons. Timur kept his word. They were allowed to live. They were released back into the city, forced to continue their lives with the knowledge of what they had done. Timur understood that some punishments don't end with death. The fathers who survived became living warnings, broken men whose eyes carried a haunted emptiness that frightened their neighbors. They had been turned into propaganda, walking testimonies to the futility of resisting Timur. Historical records indicate that over 300 fathers killed their sons that day in Damascus. The exact number isn't certain because the chroniclers couldn't agree. Some counted only those in the main square. Others included similar scenes that played out simultaneously in different parts of the city. What is certain is that the punishment achieved its goal. News of Damascus spread through the Middle East, and city after city surrendered without fighting. The calculated cruelty saved Timur's army from countless battles. But perhaps nothing illustrates the depth of Timur's sadism better than his fifth signature punishment, one that combined artistry with agony in ways that seemed to mock the very concept of civilization. It appeared most famously during his conquest of Baghdad in July 1401, and it drew on Timur's genuine appreciation for architecture and engineering. Baghdad had been one of the world's great cities, a center of learning and culture. Its libraries contained treasures of human knowledge accumulated over centuries. When it fell to Timur's forces on July 9, 1401, its scholars and intellectuals expected to be treated with some respect, as was customary even in medieval warfare. Educated men had value as administrators, translators, and advisors. Timur had different ideas. He announced that he would indeed honor Baghdad's intellectual class by incorporating them into a monument. He ordered the construction of a tower, but specified that it should be built using an unusual mortar. Instead of clay or lime, the binding agent would be living human bodies. The construction began on July 11th. A foundation was laid in the traditional manner, using stone and mortar, but once it reached waist height, the method changed. Scholars were brought forward in groups of 10. They were forced to lie on the stone layer in a radial pattern, their heads toward the center, their feet toward the outside edge. Then fresh stones were placed on top of them, heavy enough to pin them down, but not heavy enough to kill them immediately. Traditional mortar was poured into the gaps. The scholars were still alive, could still breathe, still feel, as the next layer of human bodies was arranged on top of them. Then more stones, then more bodies. The tower grew throughout the day and into the night, illuminated by torches. The screaming from inside the structure created an acoustic effect that the builders hadn't anticipated. The hollow spaces and stone walls amplified and distorted the sounds, creating a horrible music that echoed across the ruined city. By the morning of July 12th, the tower stood 40 feet high and contained an estimated 900 people, most still alive within the structure. Some were crushed and dying. Others were trapped in pockets where they could breathe but not move, condemned to slow death by thirst and suffocation. The weight of stones and bodies above them increased as the tower rose, gradually compressing their chests until they could no longer inflate their lungs. Timur had his architects add decorative elements to the outside of the tower, glazed tiles and carved inscriptions that celebrated his victory. The structure was designed to last, built with the same attention to engineering principles that went into his beautiful mosques and palaces. He intended it to stand for generations as a monument and a warning. The truly diabolical element was how long people survived inside. The lower levels, crushed under tons of weight, died within hours or days. But higher up, where the weight was less and there were more air pockets, people lasted longer. Witnesses reported hearing moans and cries from within the tower for over a week after its completion. Guards were posted to prevent anyone from trying to dismantle it to rescue the victims. As the bodies inside decomposed, the tower began to emanate a smell that made the surrounding streets uninhabitable. Timur ordered perfumes to be poured on the exterior and incense burned around it constantly. The tower became a bizarre shrine of horror, beautiful to look at from a distance, unbearable to approach closely, and absolutely effective in communicating Timur's message. I can turn your civilization, your learning, your culture itself into a monument to my power over you. The Baghdad Tower stood for decades after Timur's death. Travelers in the mid-15th century still reported seeing it, though by then it had partially collapsed, and the remains within were finally bones. It became a landmark, included on maps, visited by the morbidly curious. In a perverse way, Timur's vision had succeeded. The scholars of Baghdad were indeed immortalized, just not in the way they might have hoped. Yet even these elaborate horrors could be surpassed when Timur felt the situation warranted it. His sixth signature punishment revealed itself during his campaign against the Ottoman Empire in 1402, and it demonstrated that his cruelty could be directed at warriors as readily as civilians, at the powerful as much as the powerless. After defeating Sultan Bayezid I at the Battle of Ankara on July 20th, 1402, Timur captured the Ottoman ruler himself, a rare prize. Bayezid was a proud warrior who had conquered much of Anatolia and the Balkans. He expected to be treated according to the customs of warfare between rulers, imprisoned in comfort, held for ransom, perhaps even released with honor after swearing fealty. Instead, Timur introduced him to a punishment that violated every expectation. Bayezid was placed in an iron cage, not a prison cell with iron bars, but an actual cage, roughly 6 feet by 6 feet by 6 feet, made of iron bars spaced close enough together that he couldn't squeeze through. The cage was designed so that Bayezid could sit, could crouch, could lie curled in a fetal position, but could never fully stand or stretch out. He was naked, exposed to the elements and to the gaze of anyone who passed by. The cage was then incorporated into Timur's traveling court. It was loaded onto a wagon and hauled with the army wherever it went. At night, when Timur feasted in his pavilion, the cage was positioned nearby so Bayezid could watch the festivities, smell the food, see the wine flowing. Sometimes Timur would have choice morsels delivered to the cage, forcing the Sultan to eat like an animal, reaching through the bars with his hands. But the physical imprisonment was just the foundation of the punishment. Timur added layers of psychological torture specifically designed to break a proud warrior's spirit. Bayezid's wife, Olivera, had been captured along with him. Timur forced her to serve naked at his feasts, carrying wine and food to his officers, while her husband watched helplessly from his cage. When Bayezid averted his eyes or shouted protests, guards would beat the cage with iron rods, the reverberations causing painful vibrations through Bayezid's body where it touched the metal. The former Sultan was paraded through cities he had once ruled, displayed in his cage as Timur's trophy. Crowds would gather to see the mighty Bayezid reduced to a caged animal. Some threw garbage at him, others simply stared in silence, confronting the brutal reality of how quickly power could reverse. The psychological impact went beyond Bayezid himself. Every ruler in the region received the message that neither rank nor power guaranteed dignified treatment under Timur. Contemporary sources disagree on exactly how long Bayezid survived in the cage. Some claim 8 months, others say less. What they agree on is that he died still imprisoned, still caged, still being dragged around with Timur's army. Some accounts say he committed suicide by smashing his head against the iron bars. Others claim he simply gave up, refusing food and water until death came. One particularly detailed chronicle claims that Bayezid's last words were not curses against Timur, but a prayer thanking God for ending his suffering. Timur had the cage preserved after Bayezid's death, keeping it as a piece of furniture in his palace. Visitors reported seeing it there, empty but maintained, polished regularly by slaves. It served as a conversation piece, a tangible reminder of Timur's triumph over one of the era's most powerful rulers. This brings us to the 7th and perhaps most psychologically sophisticated of Timur's signature punishments, one that reveals the calculating intelligence behind the brutality. It emerged during multiple campaigns, but was most systematically applied during the conquest of India in 1398-1399. This punishment didn't rely on physical torture devices or spectacular violence. Instead, it turned human psychology itself into a weapon. After capturing cities, Timur would identify local leaders, not just military commanders, but respected community figures, religious leaders, wealthy merchants, anyone with influence or prestige. These people would be gathered together, perhaps 100 or 200 from a major city. Then Timur would make them an offer. He would release them unharmed on one condition. They must go to the next city in his path and accurately describe everything they had witnessed of Timur's conquests. They must tell the truth about the massacres, the torture, the pyramids of skulls. They must explain in detail what happened to cities that resisted, and they must do this convincingly, making it clear to the next city's population that the same fate awaited them unless they surrendered immediately. If they succeeded, if the next city surrendered without fighting, they and their families would live. If the next city resisted and Timur had to fight his way in, he would track down these messengers and kill them, along with their entire extended families, using whatever punishment method seemed most appropriate. The psychological torture was exquisite. These community leaders, men and women of pride and dignity, were forced to become instruments of terror against their own people. They had to choose between loyalty to cities that might be inhabited by friends, relatives, or co-religionists, and the survival of their own immediate families. There was no good choice, only gradations of moral catastrophe. Timur sweetened the poison by treating these messengers well during their brief time in his camp. They were fed, clothed, even allowed to bathe and rest. He would sometimes meet with them personally, speaking calmly about his conquests, explaining his philosophy of empire building through terror. He treated them almost as colleagues, as fellow professionals engaged in the business of conquest. This made what he was asking them to do even more disturbing. He wasn't forcing them through overt threats in every moment, but rather presenting this horrific task as a reasonable business proposition. The messengers would depart, usually in groups, carrying letters from Timur and their own traumatized memories. Historical records show that this system was devastatingly effective. Cities that received these delegations almost always surrendered. The messengers, after all, had nothing to gain from exaggerating. They were local people, known to the communities they addressed, speaking their languages and sharing their cultural references. When they described Timur's atrocities, they could do so with the credibility of eyewitnesses who had every reason to understate rather than exaggerate. The cruelest element was that even successful messengers were fundamentally broken by the experience. They had betrayed their own people to save their families, had spread terror that might have led to others' enslavement or deaths. Some records indicate that many of these messengers, even after being released, chose suicide within months or years, unable to live with what they had done. Timur employed this tactic throughout his Indian campaign with remarkable consistency. After taking one city, he would dispatch its leaders to the next. As his army moved through India, a wave of terror preceded it, carried not by foreign invaders, but by the survivors of his previous conquests. It was psychological warfare of a sophistication that wouldn't be seen again until modern times. The effectiveness of this approach revealed itself in the numbers. Timur's Indian campaign lasted only about 8 months, but resulted in the conquest of territories that might have taken years to subdue through conventional warfare. The majority of cities surrendered without fighting, their populations paralyzed by terror, carefully cultivated and distributed by Timur's forced messengers. What makes Timur's story so chilling isn't just the individual acts of cruelty, but the systematic nature of it all. These weren't the random brutalities of an undisciplined army, or the rage-fueled massacres of a madman. These were calculated instruments of policy, carefully designed, thoroughly implemented, and meticulously documented. Timur kept records. He studied results. He refined his methods based on what worked and what didn't. His secretaries preserved detailed accounts of his campaigns, including descriptions of punishments and their effects. These documents survived in various forms and were studied by later conquerors. The Mughal emperors, who descended from Timur, maintained copies of these records in their libraries. Ottoman sultans had them translated. Even European rulers eventually acquired versions, though they found the content so disturbing that many kept them locked away, available only to specific advisors. The psychological impact of Timur's reign extended far beyond his death in 1405. For generations afterward, across the vast territories he had terrorized, his name remained synonymous with ultimate cruelty. Mothers would threaten misbehaving children with "Timur will get you." Adults used his name as the standard for describing anything terrible. "Worse than Timur" became a common phrase meaning the worst imaginable. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy is how effective his methods proved. Timur built an empire that stretched across much of Asia and the Middle East, conquered territories that had resisted other invaders, and did it all in roughly 35 years of active campaigning. The terror he cultivated meant that each successive campaign required less actual fighting than the last. Cities surrendered at the news of his approach. Armies disbanded rather than face him. His reputation became a weapon more powerful than his actual forces. Modern historians struggle with how to assess Timur. On one hand, he was a genuine military genius, whose tactical innovations influenced warfare for centuries. He was also a patron of the arts, who built magnificent monuments, some of which still stand in Samarkand and other Central Asian cities. He established institutions of learning and supported scholars and artists. On the other hand, the sheer scale of suffering he inflicted is almost incomprehensible. 17 million deaths in a world with a much smaller population, cities emptied of their populations, entire regions depopulated, and not just death, but death delivered in ways specifically designed to maximize suffering and terror. The 7 punishments described here represent only the most distinctive of Timur's methods. His armies employed conventional massacres, enslavement, and destruction on a massive scale as well. But these signature punishments reveal the mind behind the brutality, calculating, patient, systematic, and utterly ruthless in pursuit of efficiency through terror. In the end, what made grown men beg for death wasn't just physical pain, though Timur's punishments certainly provided that in abundance. It was the combination of physical agony, psychological torment, and the complete stripping away of dignity and hope. His victims didn't just suffer, they suffered in ways that violated their deepest beliefs about death, honor, and human decency. They suffered while knowing that their suffering served a calculated purpose, that they were being used as propaganda, that their agony was meant to terrify others into submission. Timur died in his bed at age 68 while preparing yet another campaign, this time against China. He never faced justice for his atrocities, never suffered the punishments he had inflicted on millions. His tomb in Samarkand became a shrine, visited by rulers and dignitaries. When Soviet archaeologists opened it in 1941, they found a skeleton matching descriptions of Timur, a tall man with a withered right leg, hence the Lame. Legend claims that a curse was inscribed inside the tomb, warning against disturbing his remains. Whether or not that's true, the archaeologists opened it on June 20th, 1941. 2 days later, on June 22nd, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, beginning the most devastating conflict in human history. Perhaps there was no curse. Perhaps it was simply coincidence. But given Timur's legacy, given the long shadow of suffering he cast across centuries, it's somehow fitting that his name remains associated with catastrophe even hundreds of years after his death. The man who made grown men beg for death, who turned human suffering into an instrument of empire, who demonstrated that cruelty could be both an art and a science, left a mark on human history that time has not erased. His story serves as a reminder of what humans are capable of, both in terms of strategic brilliance and bottomless cruelty. It demonstrates that civilization is always fragile, that the mechanisms of mass suffering can be erected with terrible efficiency, and that the worst atrocities are often committed not in blind rage, but in cold calculation. Timur wasn't a monster in the sense of being inhuman. He was something worse. He was entirely human, possessed of all the intelligence, creativity, and capacity for planning that humanity can muster, and he turned all of it toward the systematic infliction of suffering. The men who begged for death under Timur's punishments weren't begging because of simple pain. They were begging because they had been shown, in the most visceral way possible, that their suffering had no meaning beyond serving as a warning to others, that their lives had been reduced to mere instruments of terror, and that death, which they might have faced with courage in battle, had been transformed into a distant hope rather than a present threat. They begged because Timur had found ways to make death itself seem like mercy, and then had denied them even that small kindness. This is the true horror of Timur's legacy, not just the body count, not just the suffering, but the demonstration that human ingenuity could be turned so completely toward the goal of inflicting maximum psychological and physical torment. He proved that terror could be systematized, that cruelty could be refined, and that the worst nightmares of human suffering could be designed, implemented, and perpetuated with the same careful planning that goes into building cathedrals or composing symphonies. 700 years later, we remember Timur not because he was uniquely evil. History has produced many mass murderers, but because he was uniquely systematic in his evil, transforming brutality from random violence into calculated policy. The men who begged for death under his rule were begging not just to end their pain, but to escape a world where human creativity had been perverted into an engine of suffering, where every new day might bring some fresh innovation in agony. That, ultimately, is what made Timur's punishment so unbearable, and what makes his story so disturbing even now. He demonstrated that there is no bottom to human cruelty when intelligence, resources, and ruthlessness combine without constraint. The screams that echoed from his war camps 6 centuries ago still echo in the historical record, a permanent warning of what humanity can become when mercy dies and calculation takes its place.